Explain to us the importance of the EU customs union, and can you also explain why Theresa May and her fellow cabinet ministers were thrashing out the details here when the EU had said the entire thing, any option, was unworkable in the first place?
Well, that is indeed the interesting question, Julia, because when we talk about the customs union, Britain has said they want to leave the customs union because they want to have its own independent trade policy. But all of this crystallizes, of course, around the question of the Irish border, because if the UK will be leaving the customs union, then there has to be a hard border at its exterior, which would be where Northern Ireland is. That is impossible. So they're trying to find workarounds. Theresa May has suggested not staying in the customs union, but instead striking a customs partnership. And what she had proposed was that the UK would gather the tariffs that for goods coming into the UK that were destined to the EU. The EU obviously said, we don't like that option, that's a no-go. The hardcore Brexiteers, who also want to avoid a border in Northern Ireland, said, well, why don't we have the max fax option, which is basically using technology as yet to be defined, technology that doesn't exist, technology that hasn't been set up, to have a seamless border. So basically the problem is that none of these options are workable. In the draft text, we have a backstop, which the European Commission insisted, which would essentially keep Northern Ireland in the customs union and the rest of the UK out. So you then have a border in the Irish Sea. That is not acceptable to the DUP, which is the pro-unionist party in power in Northern Ireland. So whatever way you want to look at it, it's impossible to square the circle.
That's exactly it. It's impossible to square the circle. And we've talked to you many times, Nina. You've also often said that whatever decisions the UK makes, it's kicking the can down the road, or it's agreeing on some kind of fudge. Can Theresa May continue to delay decisions, key decisions here? I mean, at some point, she's going to run up against an actual hard deadline of Brexit's going to happen without decisions being made.
Absolutely, and I think thus far Theresa May has been able to kick the can down the road, but ultimately at some point the fudge has to end. And the fudge, of course, crystallizes around the issue of Northern Ireland. The UK will be leaving in March 2019, so that is definitely going to happen. So before then, if there is some kind of deal to be put in place, legislation needs to go through both the British Parliament as well as the European Parliament. The Irish government needs to have clarity, so the fudge has to end at some point. Essentially, the only two viable possibilities I see is that there will be a border in the Irish Sea, which is unacceptable to both Northern Ireland's DUP and the British government, or the entire UK has to stay in the customs union. Failing an arrangement on that, then Britain has to basically crash out with no deal.
All right, Nina, I'm going to ask a dumb question about how UK government works. What's the deal with these House of Lords votes that Theresa May keeps losing, and what impact do those have?
So basically the House of Lords is overseeing the legislation that's passing through the Parliament, which is the EU withdrawal bill. So the domestic legislation to make sure that the UK can leave the EU. The House of Lords does not have the final say. So they will make amendments to the legislation and they'll pass it back to the Commons. So it's a kind of ping pong. But of course for Theresa May, she looks very weak when she keeps losing these votes in the House of Lords. Ultimately, however, what matters is the vote in the House of Commons. And let's not forget that there will be a vote in the House of Commons, which the government has been pushing the can down the line because they're afraid they're going to lose it, and that is whether or not the UK should stay in the customs union. Here, Labour has already said that their position is that the UK should stay in the customs union. The question is, will enough Tories, those are MPs in Theresa May's own party, rebel against her to keep her in the customs union? That, of course, would be a crisis because that is unacceptable to the Brexiteers. And if that happens, the question next is, will the government collapse? We have a few months left until leaving day, and that, of course, would be the worst outcome for the UK.
Head in hands. From one form of government dysfunction to another form of dysfunction minus a government. Let's talk about Italy, Nina. Is progress ultimately being made towards a government, or are we looking at some form of interim solution here and fresh elections?
We are not having much progress in Italy either, unfortunately. And as we talked about a few months ago after the election, we had discussed how the markets had kind of factored in a messy coalition outcome. And since then, the talks have been starting, stalling. The big question on the table was if the two kind of Eurosceptic parties, that's the Lega Nord and the Five Star Movement, would be able to come together. Those talks have broken down. So now the Five Star, which is the largest party without a majority, is trying to scramble some something together with Renzi's party, the left-wing PD. That also isn't coming to much. So I think in Italy as well, a long period of uncertain, messy politics.
But nobody really seems to care. I mean, is it just a matter of people are so expecting Italian political dysfunction that at the margin it doesn't seem to matter much?
In the price.
Right, in the price.
Yeah, I think there's certainly an extent, I think that's certainly true to an extent, that people just expect Italian politics to be messy and that somehow they'll muddle through. But I think long term, the fact that you basically now have this makeup in Parliament where the two parties that own the most seats, that's the Five Star Movement and Lega Nord, who are intrinsically Eurosceptic and have in the past had on their agenda that they wanted to leave the euro or reform their relationship with Europe. Long term, that does not bode well. So I think we shouldn't be complacent about what's happening in Italy. I think that this year's election certainly changed the dynamics in Italy.
Yes.
You say we shouldn't be complacent about what happens in Italy. We should also not count out Silvio Berlusconi. What kind of role does he have to play here? Is he out for the count, or should we expect him to be meddling or playing a central role here?
Well, I think, don't ever write off Berlusconi. I mean, after everything he's been through and the fact that he's still in politics is quite astounding. But let's not forget also that the reason that the coalition talks between Five Star and Lega Nord broke down is because Lega Nord refused to give up Silvio Berlusconi, which was the condition that Five Star had in order to move those coalition talks forward with Lega. So I wouldn't write him off yet. He's still going to be around.